Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first Hertzman Global Intelligence call. I'm Edward Hertzman, the founder of HGI. I appreciate you supporting our launch. We are an apparel business intelligence platform delivering deep insights to the entire fashion supply chain from raw materials to store racks. As some of you may know, this isn't my first business focus on this industry, and even before that, I got my start as an executive for major sourcing companies with a focus on production in Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and China. Now, maybe some of you invited to this call haven't been receiving our weekly newsletter, so if you'd like to sign up, please visit hgi.io. That's I-O, not .com. Just one more bit of housekeeping before we begin. At HGI, we're conducting an industry-wide survey with TD Cowen about the transformation the industry is undertaking due to the climate crisis, geopolitics, inflation, and more. I'll put the link in the chat. I'd appreciate if you could take a few minutes to provide your perspective on these important topics after the call. We've received many questions if we're going to be recording this today, so you could share with your teams. We will be, and we will publish it later. And if you have any questions, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and enter it there. The hour is going to go by fast, but we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. All right, so let me introduce today's speakers. Munir is the founder of the M5 Groupe, a network of 10 leading supply chain companies. Jason is the president of Li Fung's wholesale and distribution business in the United States. And Steve is the president and CEO of the American Apparel and Footwear Association trade group. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining, and let's dive right in. So, Steve, I apologize in advance. I know you're probably very tired of talking about this topic, but first question comes to you. Preliminary trade deals are happening. Though some reports say the announced tariff rates may not be accurate or they're up for negotiation, but whatever the reciprocal tariff rates end up being for each country, there's confusion about whether they will be applied to in addition to the existing duties and tariffs. Some people are calling this stacking. Can you explain both of these points a little bit? You're on mute.
Sorry, I was trying to practice good hygiene and stay on mute. So, but thanks a lot, Eddie, for the question, and great to be on with Jason and Munir. Look, we're in an art of the deal moment right now. I think that's kind of probably what you can expect from the letters that went out and some of the social media tweets and posts. I think what's really important is for folks to just really focus on kind of what's knowable, what actually emerges from the government in form of, either executive orders or proclamations, what customs posts in terms of Federal Register notices, customs messages. Those are the things around which, business decisions should be made. I mean, I think the rest of the stuff gives you kind of clues and hints and indications, but you may find that you're basing something on a tweet that a particular country gets X% tariff rate, and then it turns out that the details don't back that up in the way that you expected it to be. So I really would encourage folks just to kind of focus on what's knowable. Rest of the stuff, pay attention to, but it can drive you crazy if you try to plan your businesses around all of those very specific details, which are not details yet, which are just simply social media tweets. Stacking, great question. Stacking refers to this concept of how the new tariffs will be applied. And quite simply, will these new reciprocal tariffs or baseline tariffs be applied on top of the existing MFN tariffs that are already in place and have been in place for 95 years? We just celebrated the 95th anniversary. Or will they replace them? Or will they be sort of the greater of the two? And kind of one of the ways this concept has been talked about is if there's you would say sort of the highest of the existing MFN rate or the new baseline rate. So if, let's say, the rate is 20% in an agreement and the product has an MFN rate of 17%, is it 17% plus 20, or the 20 kind of replaces the 17 and then that 17 kind of rides up 3 percentage points to the 20? That's that stacking or anti-stacking concept that people are talking about. It's getting a lot of discussion in the administration. I think we'll have to see, again, what the details look like when these agreements are finally announced, whether the administration agrees that these should not be stacked or not. But we keep focusing the administration on the fact that this industry already pays very, very high tariffs. We pay on average about 5% higher tariff rates than the rest of the economy. And in 2024, we paid about 25% of the tariffs the U.S. government collected, even though we only accounted for about 5% of the imports that came in. So really, really important detail to be resolved once these agreements are announced.
So Jason, kind of a follow-up to that, the potential tariff rates right now for the apparel producing countries could be as high as 35, 40%. What's your sourcing strategy as we round out the year and start planning for spring 26 goods? And kind of to tag on to what Steve said, unclear whether it's stacking or not stacking, how are you kind of, advising your clients how to plan around that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we live in an incredibly volatile world today where there's so much uncertainty at every turn. But I think the one thing that we're certain of is that we're going to continue to be uncertain because whatever gets finalized doesn't mean it stays that way. And we live in a volatile place where we need to be used to disruption that is going to be continuous. Like going back to the pre-COVID years when you had 20 years of predictability is kind of not in the cards. We had so many events in the last 5 years. So how do you manage the unknown, right? How do you manage when you think something is safe and then all of a sudden it's not safe? And you think something else that wasn't safe now is safe. And so the concept of risk on, risk off, continuously evolving and pivoting, goes back to agile supply chains. And it's not about, well, it used to be a China plus one concept, say 5 years ago or a couple years ago. Today, it really is about, should my diversification just be excessive diversification? So it's not like, okay, I should run in two places. It's how do I think about the world with total diversification to leverage the entire footprint, just like a financial manager would be managing your 401k portfolio. It wouldn't be just in, high return, high risk stocks. You're going to balance that portfolio. So the more you balance your portfolio, the less any one event creates volatility to you. And so globalization of your supply chain is more relevant today than ever, just because you don't know, is it going to be 35? We look at it as, sorry for the long answer, but if we look at the 35% as really a negotiation ploy, which we all know it is, and everything is the byproduct of a bullwhip effect. It's not going to be way down here, and it's not going to be way over here. It's going to be somewhere here. And if Vietnam becomes sort of the medium between a 10% UK world and what's potentially a 30% China world, well, the baseline now becomes the 20. And if 20 becomes what we should be expecting, that's still going to be a 10% worsening of where we were in the pause, which was the 10% baseload. So stacking or no stacking, like Stephen has mentioned, is very vague in terms of that piece of it. But putting that aside, you have to assume that, the tide just went up for everybody. Essentially, the average goes from an average of what was, say, a 30% China and 10% world, maybe the average is 13, to what technically now is a 20% average between 10, 20, and 30. And so if 20 is now your norm, well, if you're a country, you need to be working to be better than 20, because then you have a competitive advantage relative to your peers, relative to 6 months ago, right? To where the world was before. And conversely, if you get a 25% tariff, you're in a 5% worse off position versus the average of your peers. So it's really more about where am I relative to everybody else in the landscape of competitiveness. When importers and brands need to pay a higher tariff year one, you sort that out. It will be what it is, whatever that average is. If it goes from 10 to 20 or 0 to 10, it will be what it is. But a year from now, we'll be comping whatever this is, and then it becomes the norm. Once you go a year forward, now it's the standard, and then it's just about modifications to the comp of last year. So it's only a challenge, frankly, and a mega challenge in the year when the change is happening, where there's volatility and uncertainty. But of course, we know there'll be a lot of future uncertainty. So sorry for the long answer, but that was sort of a big question.
No, that's a great answer. So Munir, we're hearing reports and a lot of chatter that some orders are being paused, canceled. Is this the case? What are you seeing in your offices throughout the world? How are specifically the American buyers reacting to all this uncertainty?
I think to be cautious, there's no cancellation as such. If something hasn't been placed, it's been paused and shopped around. But shopped around in what context? Where does one take that? And who are you in that food chain? If you make a very good brand label yoga pant, you probably have a better chance than somebody who ships to the deepest discounter in United States. So it's about price sensitivity also. And also when you, like Jason said, move around, diversification, it's not that easy. And it's not that everybody's waiting for a new customer in a country which all of a sudden becomes favorable. So let's say if you are Jordan or Egypt, there's already a line there, and they'll choose because they'll have duty-free plus the tariff. And when it comes to these cancellations, that's not happened as yet, but there are some pauses, and the pauses is to negotiate at this moment in certain cases where we do not even know with half a dozen countries where the duty or additional tariff is going to be. And in some countries where we've heard, like Bangladesh or Cambodia, that those rates are not executable because they were already selling at a price point to the ultimate buyers or to an importer who had high licensing fees. So it's not digestible. So there is a lot of chaos right now. And I think we'll have to see the next 3 weeks.
Jason, I just want to follow up to the point you made. I would call it almost excessive diversification. You're placing billions of dollars. You have a huge leverage when you're going into the factories. But for maybe someone that's on the call that's placing 50 or 100 million or 200 million, does excessive diversification dilute economies of scale or how meaningful you are to a partner? Or would you say in this moment it's worth the risk to maybe be a little less important to one factory right now?
Well, you can't turn your supply chain upside down. If you have a 20-year relationship, you're not just saying, goodbye, I'm going somewhere else. One, you're taking excessive risk because you have the unpredictability of the new. But everything is about the right proportions. And I would say most of us have tried to get as lean as possible over the past 20 years and continue even through COVID to not abandon lean. But lean basically eliminates diversification, go deeper with less, improve your quality, lower your costs. But it wasn't built for these jolts that we're dealing with that consistently either supply chain in COVID or a tax on top. And so it's not about all or nothing, it's about the right proportion. So you're not leaving your core supply chain, but you're going to balance it off a little bit more. And if you're a $100 million firm, you'll probably producing in 6 or 7 countries. And within that, you can think about regionalization. We like to think about China as a region, ASEAN as a region, the Indian subcontinent's a region, Africa's a region. You don't have to be in all regions. Let's say you're in 3 of them, but you don't want all your eggs in one region, because if something happens in a certain area, you have nowhere else to go. So you still have some diversification within region in your sourcing approach. It just doesn't mean that you take everything from here and move it to here. And the capacities, frankly, are just not available for the whole world to be pivoting all over the place. But it's about creating the balance of the portfolio. And I got to say, and we're a victim of this as well, where we've had great vendors and great factories, we've basically said, let's put the whole program in one place because we have such a great track record in this factory for execution. And that's nothing wrong with that. And that's led to better quality. But let's just say we do 2/3 in that factory and 1/3 somewhere else for a just in case. And you start having this approach. But diversification like this can sometimes come with a cost, right? The more you go deeper with one guy, the more waste you pull out of the system, the lower your cost. So it's an insurance policy. There's a cost to insurance, but it affects, the catastrophic failure that potentially can be out there. So you have to find the balance of, and I talk about this a lot in our world. What's the maximum alpha with the minimum beta? What's the maximum income, or return rate you can have for the minimal amount of risk? And we balance risk and income in this industry. And that's what diversification really is, right? I'm willing to take less to ensure something else from happening. So I think it's more about that. And you're just not abandoning your supply chains. It's about right sizing and just thinking strategically, Do I have too many eggs in too few baskets? Am I specializing in a product category where I'm really the master of my own domain and I can pivot my supply chain because I know this product inside and out? Maybe I shouldn't be in this product that's only 2% of my volume when I'm really not an expert and I should double down on my expertise. I can manage the volatility easier. So a lot of these questions get raised up. In our world, we're fortunate enough to have scale and size, and we work in 35 countries. And it definitely is an advantage by having boots on the ground in all these places. But even with that said, we're pivoting as well, just like everybody else, but within reason. You know, we're not walking away from core relationships.
Steve, another question for you. I think this industry needs a little clarification. Rule of origin. Like, rule of origin is, some people are calling it transshipment. What is rule of origin? What is transshipment? And how is the US even prepared to enforce these rules the way Trump's kind of talking about it?
You know, we're asking the U.S. government the same question, and they don't have any answers yet. You know, I think you know, there's a lot of press reports out there that, you know, these new trade agreements that are being negotiated may incorporate new rules of origin for these new tariff rates that are being talked about. We saw that's Truth Social post about 20% for Vietnam, 40% for transshipment, and a lot of people were like, wait a minute, I thought transshipment was illegal. Is the president now suggesting that something that's illegal is now going to be legal but highly taxed? Does that 40% get stacked on top of the 20%? I mean, there's a gazillion questions that come out of this. You know, again, this is a good reminder that, you know, in addition to the tariff rates, a lot of these other details are going to matter too. I mean, you may have a situation where you see a tariff rate, you know, we talked about this, 19% from Indonesia, and some people may be like, great, 19%, that's so much better than what it was before, I'll take it. But then what happens if you can't meet the requirements to qualify for that 19%? So you may be thinking that there's a good tariff rate on the table, but if you can't meet the rules to attain that tariff rate, because you don't know how customs is going to enforce it, or you don't have enough time to move your supply chain so you can be in compliance with it because it's got new requirements, that 19% may sort of be you know, a paper benefit, something that doesn't really apply to you. And that's why we, and I would include customs here as well, are going to need time for these details to take effect before these new supply chain requirements are actually implemented. I mean, you can't just sort of, you know, we have this August 1st date, you know, we can't just sort of say, okay, these things take effect on August 2nd and go. It takes time. You know, Congress just changed the rules on de minimis a couple of weeks ago as part of that big, beautiful bill. They gave a 2-year phase out. I mean, it was great that Congress discovered their Article 1, Section 8 tariff authority. And then when they did, they also did it in a way that gives the industry time to make changes. And again, this is a relatively small provision. I mean, it's got big consequences. As we're looking at these trade agreements, which are going to be affecting everything here, it's going to be time. We're going to need that time. And there's a really vital point here too. These higher tariffs, you know, at least initially, they're going to squeeze margins for legitimate players. But at the same time, they're going to increase margins for illegitimate players. And that's why, you know, we have a strong interest in making sure there is really good enforcement for these agreements. But that's why that enforcement needs to be done properly, and it also needs to be done in a way that treats trusted traders like partners.
Well, I'm happy you brought that up, because we are hearing crazy examples of under-invoicing, excessive LDP fraud, and I'm concerned that, to your point, this is only going to get worse. I know this is a touchy subject, but Munir, can you speak to this a little bit? What you're hearing?
Well, I think I'm one of those. I see myself without the wheelchair on that movie Big Short about this issue, and I've been engaged with the association, with the trade enforcement at CBP. Before, it was a game between 16% and 34%, and the rules applied to everybody, and the differential was such that it's not seen. But today, if you're a direct importer, a retailer, and wholesaler with license fee can give you something 20% cheaper than what was just going to be your basic FOB cost, doesn't matter how ineffective your sourcing department is, something's wrong. And the impunity by which today managers, sourcing executives, and owners are allowing this discounting to go 70 to 80% of FOB is pitiful. This is going to blow up. And there only needs to be one rule which can come in, and people are working on it, that a third-party broker cannot file for your duties and release the goods, and then you send a new invoice directly to the vendor. This is going to blow up. And when this blows up, there's going to be an interesting situation of companies, even those who've sold. There could be clauses in the companies who've sold that you had fraudulent practices in your supply chain. And there has to be some differentiation now between legitimate and allegedly illegitimate companies who actually are right now marketing big brands, and one needs to be careful instead of being lured into this by teams and greed. So, like I said, it's a big shot, but this shit's going to hit the fan very soon.
Steve, I just want to stay on this for 1 second. Are you saying, going back to, there's not clarity on what the definition of transshipping is, but are you saying there is a world where someone could be making a product in Bangladesh with fabric from China, and that could, in this new world, be a 40% tariff if Trump's saying those components are transshipped? And that's part one to the question. So let's start with that.
Well, okay, so again, transshipment is the concept of you make it in country A, you ship it to country B, you slap a label on it, and now you say it's a good of country B, right? That's illegal. I don't think that's what this transshipment concept is that the president was referring to in his Truth Social post. No one kind of on the outside really knows for sure. And I think, we're all not going to collectively know until we actually see the details of what that agreement looks like. And if we see that those same kinds of provisions in the other agreements, we heard this news about Indonesia. So we all have to kind of wait and see what that looks like. If you kind of look at some of the conversations that have been taking place in Mexico in the last couple of years, by folks in Congress and in the administration and in the Republican Party, they've been talking about cracking down on goods in Mexico that contain a high value of inputs that come in from China, and electric vehicles and some other things like that. So if you kind of take that concept and sort of apply it to our industry, then the question becomes, are they looking at thresholds? Are they looking at materials? Will it be, if you use fabric from China or fabric from a certain actor in China, or yarn or other materials or fibers? These are all questions we don't know. We do have an analog in that we have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which basically says if you make something in a country and it uses inputs from this region, from another country, that's not going to be allowed into the United States. And customs already has a very, very difficult time enforcing that provision, understanding what that provision means. They've not done a very good job of communicating, evidentiary standards, for example, on that. So if you kind of take that concept and apply it to a much larger scale and scope, I think customs is going to have a difficult problem from the outset. And I think the industry is as well, because, people have done a really good job, for example, of diversifying from China at the tier 1 level. But when you get to tier 2 and tier 3, that diversification isn't nearly as robust. So is that going to put other trade in those other countries at peril? And then you now have possibly the administration kind of doing two different things. Do they want China, for example, to buy more cotton from the United States, but then penalize companies that use fabric or yarn that is made from that U.S. cotton that's now bought and sold into China, right? So there needs to be a better alignment of kind of the way these different agreements are going to be trying to ask kind of supply chains to orient themselves. And I'm not convinced that that alignment conversation is really happening fully as it needs to be.
I think, Eddie, this was more a message to maybe Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar, and Vietnam still has much better customs arrangement that, if you try to make goods in China and bring it through Cambodia or, I don't know, Myanmar people don't buy in the US. So you will get flagged. So this could be just another warning. But earlier, what you were saying about car is there's a common term, completely knocked down unit or partially knocked down unit. How much comes in just raw material form and what percentage of your import is that, and how much comes in a completely assembled form where you're just doing mislabeling or relabeling and shipping the goods out. So I think it's more of to raise that flag that we are going to watch that. I think physically enforcing that, it used to be back in the day where customs agents would go and visit factories. I don't know if you remember, Steve, they used to do that in Hong Kong and other places and say that it's physically not possible to make this quantity over here. But I think with the amount of curbs put on budgets right now, this will not be enforceable, in my opinion.
All right, Jason, you and I had a conversation a couple weeks ago, and you were saying that you're intentionally placing a portion of your goods for spring in China. And that kind of made me start to wonder, as much as the administration is like anti-China, is China going to be actually a benefactor from everything that's happening in the world? Because sometimes the devil you know is maybe better than the devil you don't.
It is, right? And we've never said in Li Fung we are not doing business in China. We've always said we're going to manage the right ratio for all countries based upon what's the right value add. If you want to be in the speed business and be able to do chase businesses and turn them in 30 days to FOB, there's almost nowhere else to go if you really want to work that fast in scale. And so there always is a place based upon the right value that's being delivered. So yeah, so we, of course, over the last few years have balanced the entire world in our diversification strategy. And in our spring business right now, you need to make choices, because if you have a delivery of something that is going to be in store, say 12/25, you kind of have to start moving your fabric. And you can't wait, and just be casual and say, we'll take a month off and we'll wait until August 15th and then decide what our supply chain looks like, because you can't deliver on expectations. So you need to make choices with uncertain information. And so how do you make the uncertain to some degree of certainty? And that balancing of risk means, it doesn't mean you don't use China. It just means you use China just like you did before, but in the correct proportion. And some people are saying, I don't want to use China, and I don't want to use Bangladesh because it's potentially 35, and I don't want to use Cambodia because it's potentially high 30s, right? At the end of the day, you're going to have to take your best bet and take an educated guess and be comfortable with that. Things are probably going to average out at around 20. And what's the right place to make product without having too many eggs in one basket? So under that concept, we wouldn't say we're not using China. I'm not saying I'm going to make China my feature country of our entire supply chain, but the right product in the right country with the proper diversification, looking for that portfolio effect and leverage our entire base, absolutely is an effect.
I think the media, spends a lot of time talking about the health of the retailer or the brand and their ability to absorb tariffs and whatnot, and what this means for the consumer. I don't think there's enough conversation talking about the health of the factories and what all this uncertainty does for them. And, what is the factory financial health look like right now? Can these vendors absorb higher tariff rates? And what do you expect in terms of things like closures or consolidation at the factory level?
So here, without any conflict of interest, I can assure you that Jason's principal company, my company, and some of those companies and retailers who have offices in some of these larger sourcing countries have now put this in a things to do list about financial compliance. Yes, you can take something to see if a pillar is strong, but if the company doesn't have money to open back-to-back LC, or the company cannot pay its workers or cannot pay for the local raw materials, you can be in trouble, and there could be far more economic. I'm not saying loss of life is diminished, but financial compliance is going to be an essential part of sourcing starting now. It should have started yesterday, but I am aware of certain large European retailers who have already initiated that aspect from actually end of last quarter.
Jason, I know you have a lot to say on this. I mean, when you're going into a factory, it's one thing to look at, to Munir's point, are they compliant, et cetera, but are you doing a lot of research on who their major clients are, how much exposure they have to certain retailers? Because God forbid something happens, that that could impact you indirectly.
Right. I mean, shouldn't we always be knowing who we're doing business with? Like the financial space, it's like know your customer. Well, why not know your vendor? Know your partner, right? It's good business. But in peacetime, we all take comfort in the fact that the status quo is good and everything is all right. But we're not doing enough deep dives in general in a lot of spaces to really know what's going on in our supply chain. And it's not what you affect, it's what your partners have going on in their world. So, of course, we always look under the hood and we want to know that if we're 40% of a factory's total business, what's going on in the other 60%? Is 30% with a customer that has insolvency issues? What is going on? Because that's going to spill over into risk for us because if we're investing, moving in materials, components, taking a position, we need to be ensured that the stability throughout the supply chain, and absolutely. So that needs to happen because in the environment today of tariffs going up with uncertainty, with pushback all the way through the supply chain, like I'm going to pay this, you pay that, those debates that are going on continuously, there's a whole elk of supplier out there that's saying this is not financially viable for us right now. Maybe I should start cutting my capacity by half until this whole thing shakes out. Maybe I should take a season off until this shakes off, until we know what's going down. And knowing what's going on in the P&L or the psyche of the leadership of your partners is more important than ever when there's volatile times. And it's a bit of a game, frankly, of country Russian roulette, like you spin the wheel and see which country gets nailed this week, right? So the strategy of logic holds true until it doesn't. And we've seen in the last couple months that the volatility makes the logical turn illogical very quickly. So you just got to be prepared to be flexible. And not all factories are. Some factories could be one product in one country, in one region, and they're highly affected by what will be geopolitical, this game of upper ground. And so just knowing your customers, knowing your vendors, knowing your mills, knowing your partners, knowing your logistics provider, any one of the things in supply chain can catch you off guard at any one time. But in volatile times, it becomes that much more important. So yes, you have to look under the hood. You have to look upstream and downstream, up towards customers, back towards total supply chain, tier 2, tier 3, whatever it might be.
It's interesting when you listen to the analysts talk, oh, there's a lot of exposure to this retailer, there's a lot of exposure to that retailer. You don't really hear on these earning calls, or you don't hear all the analysts talk about the exposure to this factory group or this manufacturer. So this is a good talking point that I think is going to become more headline. I just want to stay on this topic for a second. So Munir, when you talk about financial compliance, I feel like the 10% has kind of, as Jason said, kind of the new baseline. You probably ate a little bit, the factory ate a little bit, the retailer ate a little bit, and it's kind of worked its way through the supply chain. But now we're talking 20, 30%. Who's going to eat this? Do the factories, even the healthy ones that are financially compliant, do they have the ability to eat this in a material way? And who is going to eat it?
I think the next 90 days is going to be very telling in terms of relationship, both upstream and downstream. 2026, it will go down to the consumer. It's not possible. I know there's some drilling going on here, so I'm sorry, but it's not sustainable. So part of it will go to the consumer sooner than later. So it's only about another 90 to 120 days, and this game of who's going to absorb it and what discounting will take place and who's going to share what. And like we had in our call earlier, there's going to be a new norm and there's going to be a new price, and we all have to wait. And any shortcuts, any ruthlessness, it will start telling in the time to come.
Jason, Steve, anything you want to add on this topic just before we move on?
I would just say I think the folks should really be looking at kind of where they want to be 5 years from now. One of the lessons that I think was really hammered home during the pandemic, and this does feel very pandemic-y, the world that we're in right now, is to your point, Munir, is ruthlessness, shortcuts. There was a lot of stuff like that occurred in those first couple of months, and those actions, those behaviors really created problems that supply chains weren't able to recover from. And I heard from a lot of members, now I know who the people I want to do business with. Now I know the people I want to avoid. And I think, as we're looking at sort of our supply chains and all the different ways in which our partners need to be with us to manage all the different things connected to the supply chains, I think how we treat them and how they treat us, that kind of cooperative relationship during this really, really, really emotional and critical time is going to be super important. So I think it's make the right decisions now, thinking about who I want to be with 3, 4, 5 years from now.
I'll throw in that you have to look over the horizon to next year. What's going to be the state of the consumer? Do they have discretionary income to spend at these higher levels? If they had $100 last year, do they still have $100 this year? Do they have $102? But essentially, if they're spending the same dollars and prices are inflating in some ways, then you have to look to the future of what is it that people want. In good times, economic growth times, when there's low interest rates, low inflation, people are more aspirational and they reach up into what they consume. When they feel under pressure, they actually start becoming more value driven in terms of their choices and what they do. So now the question really is what's coming next? Not today. Today we'll all sort out. That's just immediate pain, short-term pain. But in the future, is the customer going to want more value products or aspirational or something status quo? And that's going to determine the retails because, hey, yes, things cost more because there's tariffs. But if you engineer more into value products and make that a bigger percentage of your total, then it's not as prevalent, I guess, or noticeable. So I think it's like, where's the consumer going? What's coming next with the economy, inflation, unemployment, and how does it affect spending? And that's how we need to engineer and build product to what people are looking for based upon their needs 8 months from now. And because this ain't going away.
What about, the narrative of the retailer and the wholesaler is that, the factory, they're my partners, my agent is my partner. Is that goodwill kind of gone right now? Like, Jason, Munir, what are you guys hearing? Is it just, this is the price I need, figure it out, or I'm moving somewhere else? Is kind of all that goodwill that's been built up maybe after COVID gone? Was there ever goodwill? Is it probably a better question?
Should ask that to somebody else. Why me? No, just joking. When this whole thing came about in April, Liberation happened, Liberation Day, I guess you call it. He called it. But all of a sudden we went from zero to something. And when that happened, basically fall and most of the holiday was already placed. Fall was in production in April and whatnot, and finishing and shipping in May, and holiday was already bought and moving. So in that case, when that came about, there's not much that a lot of people could do. It was sort of already done. Now you just gotta basically ride it out, right? Because there's only minimal you could do. So now we're into the spring season, and we're finalizing that now over the next month or started last month and going forward. Stuff that you produce and you ship in October, November, December, January from Asia. And so under that concept, we had a little time to think about this, right? What does it really mean? So on the first phase, we're all victim of circumstance, right? We're all really caught a little surprised by the entire world aspect of it. Now it's like, okay, we need to work with what we know. Well, we know that there's essentially a 30% China and a 10% rest of the world. And anything other than that, we're going to have to figure it out when we know it. So we've all sort of absorbed into the fact that there's this 30 and 10 concept. Question is what's next? And that's unwritten, but you still had to kind of go forward and make your bets and make your plans. So is there less goodwill? Yeah, with some. With some are going to say, well, I have an option over here. I'm going to pivot to there. But most look at supply chains as something they need to protect, something that's long term. And you just can't have volatility and expect to achieve your goals long term. So, you'll have volatility on the margins, but not at the core of everything. And so is there less willingness to partner? Yeah, potentially. As more people have more pain over more time, yeah. Do you have time to engineer product into what it is you are looking for now? Yeah, you could do something about it where fall and holiday you could not. So there is the ability to design products smartly. There is the ability to diversify at the margin somewhat, let's say 20% or so, or 30% of what you have going on versus last year. And so there is some ability to kind of weight the portfolio. So there is understandably less, goodwill. There's still a lot of goodwill out there, but yet at the same time, we have to take action. We can't just sit still and wait and hope for the best. We always say hope is not a strategy that you can depend on.
Munir, you want to add anything to this?
I think that Jason's company is more than 10 times my size, but there's a lot of equilibrium and respect right now because knowledge is key. I like the Chinese word item knowledge or situation knowledge. So there is good dialogue, there's respectful dialogue, and because also this is an action taken by the United States of America. So people have not said that this is your government or my government. And the methodology which has been applied on these tariffs has been some highly unconventional. But yes, teams need to cooperate with each other and come up with a solution. And that is, you cannot just have status quo. And but right now, as we speak, there is no clarity even as of today. So that's the difficult thing. So one thing which I learned from Jason also, and that, let's start with a 20 as a line right now and see where you fall. So it's better to expect that. And it's not, it's going to be 20% on your retail price or your wholesale price. It will get diluted over the percentage. So if we were at $15 and we'll have to be at 18 on retail, or you were at $12.99, you have to be 15. I mean, look at your cappuccino prices in the suburbs or in the cities right now. They went from like $2.85 for a double tall to like $5.20, and now you're even asked to pay 18, 20, or 25% tip. So we do accept things. I think our industry has seen deflation, and the margins were shrunk more because of the supply chain costs post-landing in the Western Hemisphere, delivery, warehousing, minimum wages. So now it's the cost of goods sold. So there's going to be calm after the chaos. So I'm quite certain, but I think there will be better relationship and sanity will prevail. And of course, there is a whole generational thing, which I don't mean my kids are of that generation. I'm sure a lot of buyers, a lot of people are freaking out right now. Yeah, it's time to freak out because life's been rather comfortable the last 3.5 years after COVID and the 10 years earlier. But it's time to freak out because you don't learn these things in your merchandising class anymore.
That's a good quote. I want to go back to, and this is really a question for the group because I'm concerned about this rule of origin that Steve spoke about. I don't know, Jason, Munir, if you could talk to this with an absolute number, but I have to imagine the majority of inputs are still coming from China, from Taiwan. How much exposure is there? How does this change your sourcing strategy? Like if 50, 60, 70% of raw materials are coming from China, what does this mean for the sourcing strategy? How quickly can some of the other countries become vertically integrated? What's this look like? Obviously, to Jason's point, short term, you got to deal with it, but long term, what's kind of the plan? Jason, you want to kind of start with that?
Sure. I mean, we've been on this path for a while. This is not something that is, oh my God, I got to think about co-locating materials. We've been in that direction, frankly, for the last 6, 7 years. I mean, co-locating materials where you produce it is good business. I mean, even just from a sustainability standpoint, you're not moving product an extra 3,000 miles to get it to where, so it makes perfect sense and it's good business. How do you shorten supply chains? Co-locate your materials and your production or somewhere in the same region. So as supply chains get smaller or shorter, I should say, the pressure is to co-locate. That's been going on for a while. And that trend has been happening. We have tremendous, fabric capabilities in Vietnam, Bangladesh, Northern Africa, Turkey. Like, it's not a new thing like, oh my God, we have to develop a supply chain for raw materials. But China's been this great luxury for the longest time based on price. It's been a great price. It's easy to work there. There's limited financial needs in terms of LCs and open account and how you can do business. It's been great. And there's also this 30-year history of know-how and experience and engineer capability. They can get it right the first time because they have the experience. And so There's value in that. But the world has been moving to balance sourcing as it's been balancing balance raw materials as you balance sourcing. And it is moving that way. And so we will continue to see that trend happening. Are prices in other countries a little different? Yeah, on some items, but not all items. And is there opportunities? Definitely. And will it fast track? For sure. And will there be capacity build in material supply chain? Absolutely. Those investments will now take shape at a much faster rate. But it's there already. And most firms, I would say, if they're producing outside of China, are 50% or so leveraged to Taiwan, China, Korea in terms of raw materials. And we'll continue to see that move. It might have been 75 and 80% 5 years ago. And so that migration is already in work, some further along than others. It takes discipline. But it doesn't mean that China is wrong for raw materials. It means the right product for the right country, for the right quality level and timing that you have. And it just like how you decide how to place your goods in what country you should be doing business in, it's the right place for the right know-how, for the right need. Raw materials is no different. And if we use that lens, it actually works fairly efficiently.
So Steve, everyone is starting to place spring or work on spring 26. And you touched on this, but is there any idea of when, for certain, the reciprocal tariffs could be applied?
I'm gonna give you the same answer that anyone in the administration gives me is I don't want to get out in front of the president.
So, okay, so that's when your members are coming to you, is that basically on all these topics right now, is that the knowledge we're working with?
The knowledge we're working with is that we have 2 dates right now, actually 3 dates if I include the preferences. We've got August 1st, which is the current date that the reciprocal, the snapbacks happen and everything else. So again, don't look at the dates as mentioned in those letters. Look at the dates as mentioned in the executive order that the president put out last week. The second date is August 12th, which again is reflected in an executive order. That's when the China snapback occurs, or that's the deadline for the next things to happen. And we got some indication yesterday from Secretary Bessent that date may be a little wobbly, so we don't know, but it currently is August 12th. And then the other one, big one, is September 30th, which is when the AGOA and Haiti trade programs currently expire. Again, will those things be renewed or not? We don't know. Over the last couple of months, we've seen dates announced and dates be delayed and dates be tweaked and other announcements coming out. I think we've had 17 updates now to the harmonized tariff code, which means we're on pace to set a record for this year. I don't know whether we will or not, but it just means that the next dates, some of these dates that we have right now that are sort of kind of etched in stone may turn out to be modified or changed. I wouldn't bet on it, but I would have those plans in place. So what happens if it gets moved back 30 more days to allow for more negotiations to occur, for example?
What advice?
There's also like 10% additional on BRICS country. Then in 50 days, if Putin doesn't talk, then anyone who exports to Russia, does business with Russia, there's going to be 100%. So these are all the sideshows. So where do you cut all the noise and just go with the focus of some kind of calculation? So I'm an old school guy. I still work on Excel spreadsheets. The AI gives you all the answers, but I think the old school spreadsheet needs to come out with all the sourcing executives, putting in all the different tariffs, duties, classification, make a baseline. I call it Jason's 20%, and see where you fall. And you keep plugging those numbers and start synthesizing your buyers and your retail partners and everybody else that this could be the new out of the door price, because MSRP doesn't mean anything. It's dead since last 15 years. It's off price clubs and big discounters. You can count on your fingers. So I think this is the kind of exercises which needs to be done as we speak. So it's not to be simulated in some kind of spreadsheet or some kind of PLM ASAP, just to see where it's going to land.
When you take out your Excel and start doing the calculations. Are you taking the worst case scenario and planning for that?
Now, if you do it the worst case scenario, you're dead. So if someone just ships 200,000 outerwears or jeans on a plane, and that country's duty is changed after 10 days, instead of 35, it goes back to 15, you'll say, holy shit, what did I just do? So you can't keep going with the worst case scenario. You got to go with some kind of a logical number so that you mentally prepared yourself that, okay, it can be bad, but it can't be that bad because this much mentally I had prepared myself, prepared my boss, told my marketing team, told my retailers. So you have to start working with a band if you want to have any conversation. Otherwise, if you just freeze, as Jason says, there's no strategy. So you can, in my world, we could buy about 2-3 weeks. Maybe in Jason's world, he can't buy 2-3 weeks. But that's what it is, because the upcharge is not executable right now.
And what about, Jason, you have, you do quite a bit of business in the AGOA region. There's uncertainty with that. So how do you start placing, Q4, Q1, more importantly, in a region where you don't know if you're going to have the duty advantage anymore?
Yeah, well, that's a huge topic and a real reality. And I've been working incredibly close with Stephen and the AAFA, particularly on this topic. I've joined a bunch of their lobby days in DC, meet a bunch of the congressmen and senators. Universally, everyone is in support of figuring out a renewal of this. But we've also seen how past programs that expired in the past 5 years, GSP and others, never got renewed. And basically, the inability of Congress to act has basically frozen a lot of these things. And so with summer holidays, and Stephen's way better to speak to this than me, with summer holidays in Congress, July and August, there is not a whole lot of time to figure this thing out before the end of September. So the likely event here is that this will not be renewed, forgetting about the opinion of the president or not. That's a whole different part of this. And then the question is, do they just extend while they figure something out? So how do you handicap? It's a very unhandicappable handicap to figure this one out. So you do want to be, if you're a strategic player in Africa, Africa is the next frontier. It's globalizing, it's industrializing, infrastructure is building, there's upward mobility of the consumer who wants to buy products. There's now a whole lot more people who want to work. And this industry is really the first entry into a lot of these countries. And it's great to see the economy build because of us. But at the same time, the uncertainty now questions investments. If you build a factory, you need a 7 to 8 or 9 year ROI. Essentially, if you're going to go make a real investment, $40, $50 million in a country, in a facility. How can you do that without the certainty of if this will still remain feasible economically? So a lot of investment the last few years has stopped for real capital investment. And then you'll have to wait to see when there is certainty to see that it happens. But in the short term, do we continue to trade in the region? Of course. If we're believers in the long-term portfolio of Africa, we need to be involved in Africa. Maybe we right-size it a little bit based upon the risk tolerances, right? What's my desirable alpha with my acceptable beta? What is it in that situation? And we're going to have to right-size a little bit, but we don't just say, forget it, we're out of here. That's not the right approach, but you do got to right size while you're feeling out what's going to happen next. So in the short term, there's a slowdown of business in that region. We're doing business. We believe in that. We're making deals with vendors to partner in the next 6 months of uncertainty. And by that point, we feel there'll be more certainty. And we're willing to take some pain in that process because we're about the long-term growth of Africa. And that's really important. And if you're transactional, those vendors are not going to be with you next year when things settle down, whatever it will be. They're going to go with the people who partnered with them in tough times. So it's important to be a friend, a partner, also being smart and balancing risk. And all this has to happen live in 4 dimensions. So it's a tough answer.
Eddie, just for Steve too. Steve, historically, haven't we seen that the legislators who are Democrats, used to run the African caucus more like with a purpose. And now we also see that Trump's flagged a few African countries for excessively doing business with China. Do you think these two things, Democrats not having a majority and President Trump's beefs with some of these African countries trading a lot with China, be an issue for this to not renew?
Well, I think, to Jason's point, AGOA is, it expires in 75 days, and and the clock's running out, and so and there's very little time when they're in session to be able to renew that. There will be some opportunities coming up, but you start with the fact that there's very little time, and then the question is there a political will? I think there's broad bipartisan bicameral support for AGOA, as is there is for Haiti, also for the GSP program. But the big question is how does this fit within President Trump's vision of his trade policies and tariff policies? Democrats are in the minority, so they're not really able to be a kind of an effective force here. So then it really goes back to what are Republicans going to do on it? And then all those other issues that kind of factor into it. Does this help or hurt what people believe and what the president believes that they're doing with respect to Africa? And boy, if this webinar goes on for another hour, we can probably brainstorm on all of the different dynamics and ways this helps, whether the Central Africa meetings that occur, China issues that are connected, the South Africa dynamics, and then even specific industry dynamics as well. I wish I could tell you for sure that it will or won't happen. I will say this: the president is in a tariff raising mode right now, and AGOA is a tariff lowering concept. So I think that's probably the first place we have to look at. We're going to work like the devil to try to make it happen. I just don't know whether we'll be successful, and if we are, will it be successful before the end of September or later in the year?
So Steve, I know you hate when I ask you these prediction questions, Ben, and I know you don't have a crystal ball, but basically.
But I owe you like 3 different dinners based on my getting things wrong from your previous questions.
So I'm keeping tabs on that. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten. But I know you don't have a crystal ball, but with your experiences in DC, can you give us an idea, how long you think these tariffs are going to last? If it flips back to a Democratic administration in a few years, do they reverse it all, or this is the new norm for the foreseeable future?
I think it's the new norm for the foreseeable future. Look, there's a concept that we sort of take as an article of faith, is that tariffs are bad economics, but they're good politics. A lot of members of Congress have campaigned on tariffs to talk about doing more tariffs. A lot of sort of the political view is that constituents kind of like to see higher tariffs because it doesn't affect them, or they don't perceive that it's affecting them. So to the extent it does affect them through inflation or through other issues, job-related issues, other things, maybe it then becomes bad politics. But for the time being, and there's some data to this as well, is that when people campaign in support of tariffs, they tend to win elections. Whether they end up voting that way or not, or end up doing policies that way or not, but when they talk in terms of we should put a tariff on those imports because those other people are going to be paying the tariffs, that's kind of the rhetoric that tends to attract, I think, populist support. We are definitely in a newer, higher tariff environment. I think you have to kind of bank on that. I mean, there's a lot of chaos and confusion, but I think that's a lot of uncertainty, but I think that's one of the more certain things that's out there. It's possible. Look, anything's possible. It's possible. It will be temporary, but I wouldn't plan on it. Give you pieces of evidence. MFN tariffs, the most favored nation tariffs that we have, the tariffs that were sort of in place before President Trump's first term. Those just celebrated their 95th birthday, 95 years old. I mean, they have been around for a long, long time. The Section 301 tariffs that President Trump initiated, again, with respect to a number of products, but just China, they've been around for about 8 years, 7, 8 years right now. Candidate Biden campaigned against those Section 301 tariffs, specifically campaigned against them, and then President Biden increased them. And in fact, most of the Section 301 tariffs, the revenues, if we kind of look at all the revenues that have been collected under the Section 301 tariff authority, most of that, I think this is the case, it'll change soon. Most of that occurred under President Biden's watch than under President Trump's watch. So far, these new tariffs on top of the existing tariffs have raised about $100 billion in this fiscal year. The U.S. government has a hard time giving money back. We could see inflation numbers come up. There's a number of legal challenges that may create headwinds for some of these tariffs. But I think even in those cases, there's a number of kind of plan Bs and plan Cs and maybe even plan Ds to keep these tariffs in place or replace them. So I think it's it's sad to say, but I think you should buckle in and expect these to be here for a while. Plan for them to be here for a while. Be pleasantly surprised when they're not, or if they're not, but plan for them to be around. And I think that's the prudent course for folks to take.
Thanks, Steve. Look, I know you guys are always very busy, but given the state of affairs, I am very appreciative for your time today because I know your phone is ringing off the hook. Appreciate all the vital insights. Thank you for everyone that joined us this morning. If you haven't already, please visit hgi.io, subscribe to the newsletter, and if you could take a few minutes to fill out our supply chain survey in partnership with TD Cowen, we put the link in the chat. You can find it there. Thank you again, and hope to speak to everyone soon.